Welcome to a table for 92, element number 88, radium. It's number 88 because it has exactly 88 protons within its nucleus. For radium, I'm making a radioactive baguette. Well, I'll make a few regular ones and one radioactive baguette. This is, of course, to highlight the French contribution to the discovery of radioactivity, and because radium was discovered by Marie and Pierre Curie. Yeah, basically Marie Curie lived off bread and butter in her early career, way before she knew about radioactivity or how her life would become intertwined with radiation, quite literally. So Marie, before she met Pierre and had like a more comfortable life, she was like extremely poor and extremely hardworking. She was famous for only being able to afford bread and butter and survived on that for years while working herself so hard. She would often forget to eat and pass out in the laboratory. So upon the discovery and subsequent early research into radioactivity, Marie, her husband, basically all of her lab assistants, one of her daughters, and her son-in-law all died from radiation overexposure. Did they know the dangers of radioactivity at the time? Well, that's really controversial, and we'll get into that a little bit later. But regardless of their sacrifices to understand radioactivity, their discoveries would help to save millions of lives through radiation treatments throughout the 20th and 21st centuries. And it all really kind of started with radium. So after radium was discovered in the early 1900s, like radium was put in everything as a wonder drug. Like, I mean, it's not hard to imagine today. Like, I would compare the discovery and utilization of radium in the early 20th century to what's going on right now with artificial intelligence. People just went full steam ahead, applying radium to everything, you know, believing it to be a cure-all. But, you know, pretty soon the bodies started dropping and tons of people were dying from radium poisoning at the time. We don't know what the future of AI really stands out to be like, but, you know, I can see us looking back in 20 years and being like, hey, maybe that was a bad idea. I hope it's not going to be as bad as radium because like that did kill a lot of people, but you know, maybe AI will just be like NFTs and we'll all kind of look back and chuckle about like the bored apes and people spending like millions of dollars on. But yeah, we'll see. So before we get into radium, what makes a baguette radioactive? Well, everything is radioactive, actually, to a certain degree. It's kind of like a pet peeve of mine. Like you see in a movie, it's some sci-fi or like nuclear bomb themed movie, someone will pull out a Geiger counter and be like, there's no radiation here. There's radiation everywhere, no matter what. There's radiation from the sun, there's radiation in rocks, there's radiation in food. All foods are radioactive, but it's nothing to worry about. Like radiation's everywhere. It's only a problem when you're dealing with like highly radioactive materials or like, you know, pure radium like the Curies would soon learn. So a traditional baguette has only 4 ingredients. By French law, it has to be. Yeah, they are very serious about baguettes in France. Surprise, surprise. Yeast, water, salt, preferably sea salt, and bread flour. Bread flour all the way. It has more protein than bleached all-purpose flour, so you'll end up with that nice crunchy crust we all dream about. And yes, they are all radioactive, but it's fine. It's not much, not near enough to hurt somebody. But it does show up on the Geiger counter. What is going to make this super radioactive though is the addition of Brazil nuts. By and far, Brazil nuts are the most radioactive food on Earth. Like naturally radioactive. It's not like food that grows in Chernobyl or anything. Something to remember, like there is naturally radioactive foods like Brazil nuts or bananas, those, and mostly that radioactive potassium is what's doing it. However, Brazil nuts actually have radium in them naturally from the soil that they're grown in. Again, it's not irradiated foods from us like polluting the environment, so it's fine. Yeah, a Brazil nut like this actually contains about like 1,000 times more radium than all other foods, but it's still like low amounts. Actually, you have to worry more about selenium poisoning from Brazil nuts than radiation. I think like it's 1 to 2 Brazil nuts per day is as much selenium as you need, and people will actually die of selenium poisoning if they like eat way too many. So yeah, you die of selenium poisoning from Brazil nuts way before you die of the radioactivity in there. So the first thing with the baguette, add 1.5 teaspoons dry active yeast to 3.5 tablespoons warm water, not hot water. That'll kill the yeast. It's a living organism. And you just wait for the yeast to interact with the warm water and kind of gets like little frothy like a cappuccino. Take 3 3/4 cups bread flour and make a well. Pour in the yeasty frothy water into the flour. Then start slowly adding 2 cups of cool water until you get a thick, rougher dough. Mixing with a silicone scraper. You don't want the dough all over your hands. And spin that bowl while you're mixing it with one hand and scraping with the other. So when I was figuring out this recipe, I contacted a baker friend of mine who turned me on to the Berthenay slap and fold technique. Goes something like this: slap and fold, slap and fold. And you know, I haven't been baking my entire life like the Bertonet guy has, but you know, it's something like this, slap and fold, slap and fold. And you want to do that, of course, to activate the gluten, because that's what's going to make it super fluffy on the inside of this soon-to-be baguette. The other resource I used for this was this book, In Search of the Perfect Loaf by Samuel Fromart. Great read. Knead, slap, fold. So first off, we got to go into a little history to set up how the Curies discovered radium. When Mendeleev comes out with the periodic table in 1869, there are only 63 elements of the 92 naturally occurring elements that were known about at that time. And they didn't know about radioactivity yet. So by the late 1800s, there was still like a few holdouts on the periodic table, but no one expected like a whole new scientific field was going to be discovered, which turned out to be radioactivity. And it is hard to state how revolutionary the radioactivity was. Like, it completely changed our understanding about matter. Like, before 1895, when Becquerel was able to explain what Roentgen had discovered with X-rays, no one thought it was possible that matter could emit radioactivity. That, you know, the only way it could emit radioactivity is if it was electrified or heated. So in the late 1800s, just when we were beginning to understand radiation within light, like visible light is kind of radiation, but you know, that was still in its infancy. So this would blow up, yeah, in 1895. Wilhelm Roentgen, working at the University of Würzburg, was experimenting with vacuum tubes called Crookes cathode tubes. Roentgen was essentially just like playing with these tubes. He had no thought that he was about to, you know, discover a whole new field of science. He was simply seeing what would happen when electrical discharges were sent through the tubes and created phosphorescent light. He had an aluminum sheet over the glass as shielding with a bit of black cardboard. To his surprise, images started appearing on that black cardboard. And through a little more experimentation, he realized mysterious rays were passing through solid objects and leaving an impression of what they had passed through on the other side. So the first human experiment he did was on his wife. This is a really famous and a really funny event. I can't honestly find anywhere if like he explained to her what he was expecting to happen. But yeah, he x-rayed her left hand and showed her for the first time in human history internal images of a human skeleton that wasn't, you know, cut open to see. And she like freaked out. She like yelled out, "I have seen my death." What a great prank. That would have done so well on TikTok today. It's like, "Oh, did you think that you were dead? That's hilarious, babe." They did stay married though. She didn't divorce him over that, so that's good. Now I'm gonna cover this with a wet towel and let it sit for 1 or 2 hours, even like overnight in the fridge, but it's gonna rise a lot, get even more fluffy. So yeah, people like freaked out over x-rays. I mean, immediately people knew this was gonna change medicine forever. Like, I mean, you get to see where bullets were in gunshot victims. You can see where to set broken bones. You can see things that people have like swallowed accidentally. You can identify cancers, but they had no idea what was causing these images to appear. Like Roentgen, he named his phenomena X-rays precisely because he had no idea what was going on. X as in the unknown, like the X-Files. And so that experiment happened in November 1895. Next, it got passed on to a couple of Frenchmen named Henri. First, it was the famous mathematician Henri Poincaré, I don't know how to pronounce that, but he spoke German, so he could actually translate the findings of Roentgen, who then gave a speech about X-rays at the Académie des Sciences in Paris in January 1896, suggesting the fluorescence in the Crookes tubes were from the glass the tubes were made out of. Turns out there was Henri Becquerel, an expert in fluorescence, in the audience of that lecture, and he took that idea back to his lab and got to work. By the way, the definition of fluorescence or luminescence is the ability of a material to absorb light and beam it back out at a different frequency. Pew, pew, pew. So Becquerel and others, you know, they got to work, and as good scientists always do, they try to disprove hypotheses. It's a wonderful bit about scientists. The immediate reaction to a claim isn't to turn it into dogma, but try to refute it. And that's what quickly happened. Like, they disproved that the phosphorescence came not from the glass, but from the material inside the glass. In this case, they were working with the only kind of phosphorescent stuff Becquerel had on hand, potassium uranol. Uranol being an oxidation of uranium UO2+, not, you know, a urinal in a football game, not that kind of urinal. So in one very famous experiment in February 1896, yeah, this all happens in like 4 months. Becquerel placed the potassium uranol on a photographic plate, wrapped it in super dense black paper, and exposed it to the sun for a few hours. Remember before what I said about like the sun being known as a source of radiation? Yep, boom, the urinal salts left an impression. And yeah, more experiments were done, and yeah, they showed that chemical elements could be radioactive without being subjugated to heat or high voltage. This is where the Curies come in. Pierre, his background, pretty classic story. His father was a doctor that helped him early on in his education. They weren't wealthy, but he was able to slowly get his education as soon as he had the money to. Marie Sklodowska, pretty different story. She grew up in Russian-occupied Poland, where they had made the higher education of women illegal, as well as anything remotely celebrating Polish history or culture. So she initially went to one of these flying universities of Warsaw. These were underground, illegal centers of education, hiding from the Russian secret police, and prominent Polish educators would teach all of the banned subjects to the banned students in Poland. So she got out of occupied Poland to study in the more enlightened France at the time. However, she was in complete poverty. There's famous stories of her not being able to afford to eat and would pass out in her laboratory. She got her education, she fell in love with Pierre. They married in 1895, the very year Roentgen played that hilarious prank on his wife, making, her think she was dying. Hilarious. The Curies knew Becquerel well and were up to date on all of his experiments with uranium, but Pierre was more into magnetism at the time, while Marie was focused on uranium and especially the pitch blende ore. It's not very radioactive, this stuff. I've measured it, so it's safe to handle. Yeah, you're supposed to wear gloves, but this stuff's fine. The first big thing she figured out, though, was not just uranium was radioactive, but also thorium, and that had been discovered back in 1828. Unfortunately, though, another German physicist had already figured that out and published it 3 weeks before Marie did, so she didn't get the credit on that one. But that's how science works. But this convinced Pierre to abandon his studies in magnetism and go work full-time on radioactivity with Marie. The next big thing was studying the pitch blende uranium had come out of. It had been mined for a very long time in Czechia, where the uranium was extracted and used in all sorts of ceramics and stuff. The leftovers from mining, it's called slag, and that was just thrown out. Well, Marie and friends, they investigated that slag and found it to be still really radioactive, so they smashed up 10 tons of pitch blende, where they were able to extract 1 milligram of a new radioactive substance. Yeah, 10 tons to 1 milligram. This was analyzed under a spectroscope to see its atomic lines, which proved to be previously unknown on the atomic spectrum. It appeared as a light blue color, proving it to be a new element. By the way, this was Marie Curie's doctoral thesis. She would end up getting a Nobel Prize for her PhD thesis, and this is also where she coined the term radioactivity to explain the phenomenon of atomic decay. And yes, the word radium comes from ray. Okay, so it's been 1 to 2 hours. Feels like it, right? That was a lot of science and history. And some humorous anecdotes about Roentgen scaring his wife almost to death. Well, she kind of thought she was dead, so. Anyway, the dough has risen. All right, so this is enough for 4 loaves, so you split them up evenly, now that it's in a nice little ball like that. All right, so you roll them out kind of like Play-Doh. You want it to be maybe a foot long. Roll it out into a rectangle, and then you make this spine down the middle like that, and kind of cover it up, so that's gonna be the bottom of it. Now, yeah, roll it. Oh, got a little air in this one, that's okay. And you make the pointy ends on the end. It gives it that nice signature shape. These long, skinny loaves became popular in France in the mid-1800s, throughout France, but especially in Paris. And one story was that back then, they usually had these big round loaves, and French workers had to use knives to cut them. And in the dark French metro underground, they would be trying to share loaves of bread, and they would accidentally stab each other trying to cut pieces off. And so someone was like, okay, we need pieces of bread where you can easily tear it. And so, yeah, that's a good story. We don't really know where the origin of this is, but the word baguette literally means little rod or baton, with the shape. And that actually wasn't officially the name of these loaves until 1920. Coincidentally, that was the year the French government set new rules that no one had to work between 10 p.m. and 4 a.m., meaning that the bakers that, notoriously have to work super early, they didn't have enough time to cook those larger round rolls anymore. So they all switched over to making these more simplified little rod or baguette. But yeah, no one really knows the history of it. They're all good stories. I like the stabby story. But yeah, we'll get these done and let them rise for 30 minutes and then finish them off. Little bit more flour. All right, so we got to irradiate at least one of these. So make a nice little ants on a log, just radioactive ants on a log. There you go. Half my daily amount of selenium right there. Last thing then, spritz it with water, put it in the oven for 35 minutes at 450 degrees. Oh yeah, and also you have to have the water pan in the oven to keep that humidity, and that's gonna get you that crusty outside and fluffy inside. Of course, I'm not a master Parisian baker, but these are very, very good. So now the bread is baking. This is where the story of radium gets weird and a little murdery. As soon as the Curies announced the study, like people started figuring out better ways to extract radium. It's a glowing substance, seems magical and like otherworldly, and it became all the rage. Like it was such an optimistic time in science anyway. But yeah, people just threw caution to the wind with these new discoveries. And that's often the narrative with radium, but a lot of people knew it was not good for you. If you've never heard of the Radium girls, there were these young women who were hired to paint the dials of watches with radium paint so they would like glow in the dark, and they would lick the end of the paintbrush to keep a fine tip. So they were like exposing themselves to, like, they're swallowing radium. And they all died of like awful cancers of the mouth. It was just terrible. The narrative is, oh, no one had any idea, let alone the company profiting off their labor, the US Radium Corporation. Yeah, that's a lie. Like the owners and managers, like they totally knew radium was gonna kill these people. And they themselves tried to stay away from it, like off the factory floors. And these radium girls, they start dying off like really quickly. But some of the survivors went to the press, they hired attorneys to bring civil lawsuits against the corporation, and the corporation reacted by delaying the court proceedings as much as possible, hoping the surviving radium girls would just die off before they ever got to testify in court. Yeah, the radium girls thing, that happened during World War I, like 20 years after radium was discovered. And yeah, in that 20-year time, it had gone crazy. Like radium was applied to everything, but the dangers were like immediately noticed and promptly ignored. Remember, there was nothing regulating too, like how much of all of this basically unknown radium could be allowed in stuff. Immediately though, like the real scientists out there, they figured out like there were some strange effects with radium. Like for instance, Becquerel once took a bit of radium salt in his pocket to bring to a meeting. It burned a hole through his cloth and it burned his leg. So, you know, I already mentioned this about the episode like, in polonium, but like Marie Curie assured people in public that, you know, she and her lab assistants took all the necessary precautions, but after her death from radiation exposure induced cancer, her assistants were all like, yeah, like we weren't doing any of that in the lab, like there was no safety. And they all too died of radiation exposure related illnesses. But yeah, in that time between like the discovery of radium and its regulation, they put radium in toothpaste so like your teeth would glow. They would put it in makeup. People would paint themselves and go out like to nightclubs, like it was like modern day raves. There's also like these con artists that were trying to sell like radium as possible medical cure-alls. But yeah, a lot of like companies and these like con artists, they would actually like brand their products like having radium this, radium that, blah, 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 but they never contained radium at all. So yeah, I mean, you think con artists are having like a heyday with crypto and AI right now? It's nothing new, man. They were doing that 100 years ago. You know, grifters be grifting. We now know, yeah, sure, totally, like radium is used in cancer treatments all the time, but in 1896, like they were way off from figuring that out. But yeah, this does bring us to our conclusion though. It's like, did the radium exposure kill Marie Curie? It's controversial. Like, I honestly would say like no one really knows. But like, I mean, she was exposed to all sorts of radiation in her life, not just from radium. One likely culprit is uranium or the uranol salts from the x-rays I was talking about earlier. Even though Marie Curie didn't have practical experience with x-rays, she lectured about it, but she like never used them in a medical sense. When World War I started and Germany invaded France and was like, they were knocking on the suburbs of Paris, every able-bodied male was called up for military service, including all of her male lab assistants. The government abandoned Paris, moved to Bordeaux. They actually brought with them the 1 pure gram of radium that Curie like had been able to produce, and it was in like a special lined box. But like that's how important they thought that was. Like the government fled and were like, don't forget the radium. But yeah, Marie Curie with her daughter, they went up to the front lines to aid in the war effort, and they got funding, and they actually built these like really amazing mobile X-ray vans that they were used to identify like bullets, shrapnel, broken bones, and the wounded soldiers that were able to make it to the rear. But you know, because of the situation of the war, there was like no regular precautions put in place with the x-rays. So everybody working it got crazy doses of radiation over the next 4 years of war. And yeah, when Marie Curie died, it was a blood disease that was attributed to radiation exposure. Her body was so radioactive when she died, they buried her in a lead-lined coffin. So if you didn't know, Marie Curie was famously not elected to the French Academy of Sciences because of old-fashioned sexism. But in 1995, Marie Curie and Pierre were given the highest honor in all of France to be buried in the Pantheon. And some quick samples were taken to ensure that the workers were not exposed to radiation, like from their bodies, like that. They were actually worried about that still. And it turns out the amounts of radium in her body was like 360 becquerels, way below what the threshold is. It's like 7,000 is considered to be safe to work with today. So basically the idea is that it was not the radium she worked with, it was the X-ray work that she did during World War I that eventually killed her. However, they also noted the near absence of radium may have just been from time and an increase in safeguards in her laboratory in her later life. The half-life of radium in the body is like 900 days and 5.5 years in the bone. And also adding that osteoporosis in her old age may have also contributed to the small amounts of radium. Either way, I mean, like, yeah, the consensus, Marie Curie died of cancer brought on from radiation exposure. Exactly where it came from, we might never know. But I mean, if I had to bet, it's, you know, from a lifetime of working with radioactive elements, whether it's radium or those urinal salts later on. Speaking of, here is the world's most naturally radioactive baguettes ever created. It is good. I mean, honestly, if I saw this in a French bakery, like, I'd be like, that looks legit. Maybe not this one so much, but this looks great. And I mean, yes, they're great, but of course, like, I'm not comparing to these, like, to Parisian baguettes. Like, those people spend their life perfecting that. But, you know, fun little radioactive baguette. Hope you learned a little bit about the insane history of radium and have a little more appreciation for the Curies. They were awesome and gave their lives to expand scientific ideas. What a way to go. Oh yeah. Oh yeah. Beautiful. All right, well, this is what Marie Curie lived on for many years right here. That is fantastic. I'm very impressed with myself. Thanks. See you next time.